Welcome to another bonus edition of Upon Further Review. And in this edition, we'll be talking about the Cincinnati Bengals at the Cleveland Browns. You can catch this Week 15 matchup on December 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and that'll be aired on your local Fox affiliates. And this is Upon Further Review, where we go over all the statistics and the games played between these two teams over the season, and we look inside the numbers. And while we're doing that, we bring you some Madden gameplay where I played out the game. I take the team that I'm picking to win. In this game, I'm picking Cleveland, so I'm playing as the Browns. So these are the highlights while I go over the numbers. And so far in the season, the Bengals are 8-4-1, and the Browns are 7-6. The Bengals started off red hot. They were 3-0 in September. They started off with a win in Baltimore against the Ravens, their division rivals there in the AFC North. And this game here is the Battle of Ohio, the battle for the AFC North. But in Week 1, as I said, they beat the Ravens, their other division rival. Then in Week 2, they ended up beating the Falcons in Cincinnati, and they played in Cincinnati in Week 3, and they beat the Tennessee Titans. All three of those games they won pretty handily too. And at that point, it looked like the Bengals were well on their way to repeating as NFC North champions. They had their bye week in Week 4, but in Week 5, they went to New England, they went to Foxborough, they faced the Patriots, and they got blown out 43-17, and that was the start of their downturn. Then in Week 6, Carolina went to Cincinnati and they played to a tie. It's the first time the Bengals have not won at home in the regular season in a couple years. Last year, during the regular season, the Bengals were perfect at home in Paul Brown Stadium. But they tied against the Panthers. And then in Week 7, they went to Indianapolis and they got shut out by the Colts. But then in Week 8, they bounced back. They got their first win in October, and that was against the Ravens, and that was in Cincinnati. And they swept the Ravens in the season series between the two teams. They beat them by a field goal. Then they hosted the Jacksonville Jaguars, and they beat them by 10 points. But then in Week 10, on Thursday Night Football, the Cleveland Browns came into Cincinnati, and they won 24-3. So the first time these two teams met in 2014, it was Cleveland that came out on top by 3 touchdowns. Andy Dalton only had 86 passing yards in that game. And so then now, though they bounced back really strong with a 3-game winning streak on the road. So that loss at home against Cleveland, and that's the first loss they've had since 2012 in the regular season in Cincinnati. But with that loss, then they ended up going on the road for 3 games, but they ended up winning all 3. First in Week 11, they went to New Orleans. They beat the Saints by 17 points, 3 scores. Then they went to Houston. They beat the Texans 22-13. They beat them by 9 points. And then they went to Tampa Bay, and they just barely beat the Bucs by 1 point. But a win is a win, and they got the W. Then last week in Week 14, they hosted the Steelers in a game that was very important and would have went a long way towards them winning the North. But they lost a game that they were actually up 14-7, and they ended up losing 42-21 against their division rivals, the Steelers. Although Andy Dalton threw for 302 yards, it was his second best throwing game of the season, just behind that game where they tied. And of course, he had a whole extra period to put up those numbers, but it's the most yards he's had through the air in regulation in 2014, but they ended up losing. They couldn't get anything going on the ground, although A.J. Green had a huge game, 224 yards in that game last week. But now they're going to Cleveland in that rematch from Week 10. And for the Browns, they started off in Week 1. They went to Pittsburgh, and they lost to the Steelers, but they almost won that game. They were down, I think it was 27-3, and they came all the way back. They tied the game up, but then the Steelers won with a late field goal, and they lost 30-27. Then in week 2, they got their first victory. It was at home against the Saints. They were down in that game, but they came from behind and they won by 2 points against New Orleans. In week 3, the Ravens came to the dog pound, and the Browns lost by just 2 points. It was a close game. They almost won that one. They had their bye week in week 4. Then after the bye week, they won 2 in a row. They went to Tennessee. They beat the Titans. They were down in that game, but they came back and they won it by 1 point, 29-28. Then in week 6, they faced back off against the Pittsburgh Steelers, their division rivals there in the AFC North, the team that beat the Bengals last week. But in the rematch against the Steelers, this time in Cleveland, they won 31-10 by 21 points. They beat them that time. So they lost by 3 points, a field goal, and they won by 3 touchdowns. And so then in week 7, they went to Jacksonville, and they lost a disappointing game. They got blown out by the Jaguars 24-6. And it was when they couldn't afford to lose, especially right now. They really wish they could get that one back. But they went on a 3-game winning streak after the loss. They ended up hosting the Raiders. They beat them by 10. They hosted the Buccaneers. They beat them by 5. Hoyer threw for 300 yards in that game. It was his best game of the season at that point. Then in week 10, they ended up going to Cincinnati, and on Thursday Night Football, they dominated the Bengals. That was the first time these two teams met. Then in week 11, they went to Houston. They lost to the Texans 23-7. But in week 12, they went to Atlanta, a game they really should have lost, but the Falcons just served it up on a platter, and they beat them by 2 points with a late field goal, 26-24. But then they went on a 2-game losing streak because they ended up going to Buffalo. They lost to the Bills. Johnny Manziel actually ended up getting in that game. And actually, that win against Atlanta, that was Hoyer's best game. Even those 2 games back-to-back, he had at Houston 330 yards, and then in Atlanta 322 yards. But then in week 13, they lost to Buffalo. Then in week 14, they lost to the Colts. That was last week. They lost by just 1 point, a game they were up. I think it was like 24-10 they were up, and they let the Colts come back and win it. They even scored 2 defensive touchdowns. Hoyer just didn't get anything going. He only had 136 yards. The receivers just weren't catching the passes. They kept dropping the ball. But here we are now, week 15, Bengals-Browns rematch. Of course, the Browns beat them the first time, but who knows what's going to happen now, because what can we even take from that game necessarily? Because the thing is that now we have Johnny Manziel is going to be behind center, whereas it was Hoyer the first time around. But you see how the defense dominated Cincinnati in Cincinnati. So if the Browns could do that to them then, they should be able to play a pretty good game against them in Cleveland. Although they are, without Tayshaun Gibson, and they, both teams are banged up. We're not sure if Vontae's perfect. It's going to end up playing. Maybe he'll play, but he hasn't played in a while. If he doesn't make it back this week, maybe next week. But we shall see how that all plays out. But let's look inside the numbers for these two teams. And when it comes to passing proficiency on the season, the Bengals have the 20th most yards. They're 20th in yards through the air per game. The Bengals are 15th. So the Bengals were middle of the road before making the switch. They actually had better numbers through the air than the Bengals. And we look at pass defense. The Bengals are 21st when it comes to passing yards allowed, and the Browns are 9th. So the Browns got a good pass defense. They have a great secondary, even with the injuries, and you got to give the edge through the air to Cleveland. So then we look at the running attacks of both these two teams. The Bengals are 10th in the NFL when it comes to yards on the ground per game, and the Browns are 15th, again, middle of the road. But the Bengals, though, they do have a good running attack. That is the strength of their offense, Giovanni Bernard and Jeremy Hill. Of course, they've had some injury issues, but when they're healthy, they can run the ball pretty well. Then we look at the running defense of these two teams. The Bengals are 27th, the Browns are 26th. So both these teams have a very dismal running defense. They let up lots of yards on the ground. So we should see a lot of running. And that actually kind of plays in the favor of Johnny Manziel because he's a quarterback who likes to run. He likes to scramble. He likes to extend plays. And up front, the Bengals haven't been playing very well. Of course, they're missing Vontaze Perfect. He was their leading tackler last year. He's one of the best linebackers in football, and he's been banged up. And that's why the Bengals have been suffering on their pass defense. There is some word that maybe Vontaze will be back for this game, but I don't know really how effective he'll be, if he even is back. We'll see. We won't really know until game time, or until it gets closer to game time anyway. But, so when it comes to the running the ball, the Bengals have a slight edge, so I give the edge to the Bengals, even though their defense is kind of banged up. Then we look at the points for and against. The Bengals are 17th in the NFL in points scored per game. The Browns are 20th. So neither of these teams, they don't put up a lot of points. They're lucky if they can score 20. That's a good game for them, getting into the 20s. But we look at points allowed. The Bengals are 15th. The Browns are 11th. The Bengals, middle of the road. Browns, they've got a good defense, actually. That's the strength of their team, is their defense. Of course, they let up a lot of yards on the ground, but they don't let up yards through the air. They might let up some yards on the ground, but they don't really let up a lot of touchdowns. They're kind of a bend but don't break type of defense. But when it comes to scoring, though, advantage Cleveland because of their defense. And really the difference between how many points they score per game is only 0.4, so it's really close. Because although the Bengals are 17th, it's a three-way tie for 17th. The Browns are 20th. They're by default 20th. They're right there. So it's actually very, very close in terms of how many points they put up on the board each game. They put up similar numbers. Of course, you see in this Madden gameplay, I'm blowing them out. But that isn't necessarily, don't let that necessarily, lead you to think that would be the score. That's not necessarily, it's just how this game's playing out. I'm just whooping the crap out of the Bengals, that's just how this game is going. Doesn't mean that the Browns are going to dominate them. They did dominate them in Cincinnati. Maybe they'll do it again in Cleveland. It's possible. I do think it's going to be a closer game, though. I don't think they're going to win by 3 touchdowns like they did the first time around. I think it'll be a tighter game. It'll be fun to watch regardless because Johnny Manziel making his debut as a starter in the NFL. Something everybody's been waiting for all season. Although I was starting to think that wasn't going to happen this season. Thought, we wouldn't see him start a game till next year. But, the pressure was too much. And with 3 games left, they're 1.5 games out of first place. If they can actually beat the Bengals here, they'll be within a half a game of the Bengals. Of course, the Ravens and the Steelers, we'll see what happens with them. I'm actually picking the Steelers to lose and the Ravens to win. So the Browns do what I think they're going to do, and things play out the way I think they are. I don't know if they will, you never know. But at least according to the way I'm picking them, it'll end up with the Ravens in the lead in the division, and the Browns will be behind them by a game and a half game behind the Bengals, and the Steelers would be tied with the Browns at that point. Will that happen? I don't know. We'll see on Sunday. But actually, if we look and see with who they have left to play, the Bengals, after this game against the Browns, they've got Denver and then the rematch against Pittsburgh. So that'll be very interesting. That's going to have huge playoff implications. Both of those games, all 3 of the games left for Cincinnati, are going to have big playoff implications for both teams involved. And with Cleveland, same thing. They got this game here against the Bengals. Next week they go to Carolina. You wouldn't have thought the Panthers would be playing for a playoff spot at the moment, but they actually are technically still in it. Although once they lose this weekend against the Bucks, I believe, then it won't really matter for them so much. But then the final week of the season, the Browns are going to Baltimore to face the Ravens. So the Browns still got a chance. If they can beat Cincinnati in this game, and then they can beat Baltimore in Week 17, you never know. Stranger things have happened. They will need a lot of help, though. They're going to need some other teams to come up and beat the Steelers and the Bengals and the Ravens if they want to win the division. That's kind of a real long shot. They're going to have to win out to have any chance of that happening. And then also, the other teams are going to have to lose. So we'll see. But will they make the playoffs? That remains to be seen, too. A lot of talented teams in the AFC. Not easy to get in. They might just, miss the playoffs. I thought at the beginning of the season the Cleveland Browns were going to make it as a wild card. We'll see how it all plays out. I mean, you got so many teams right there in the hunt and all the divisions, especially this division. The AFC North is one of the toughest divisions in football this year, one of the most tightly contested for sure, and everybody's above 500. It's awesome. And then you got out west, you got the Broncos, the Chargers, even the Chiefs. Then even, the Texans aren't out of it yet. Over there in the south, obviously the Colts are the front runners, but the Texans could make the playoffs possibly. Then even in the east, you have the Dolphins fighting for a spot, and even Buffalo too. They're like teams on the outside looking in, but we'll see how it all plays out. We'll see how many teams make it from the AFC North. Maybe we end up with both wild card teams coming from that division, or just one, or maybe even none. Who knows? We won't even know. Just all coming down to the wire here in December. It's going to be really exciting to watch how it all plays out. But in this game, I think Cleveland's gonna, take the W. They're gonna get the win. They already got them the first time around, and I think Johnny Manziel, from what they're saying, the word out of Cleveland, they're saying that he's been just lighting it up in practice, having really good practices. So we'll see if that's gonna, transition into the game, if he can do that in game, on the field with live game, full pads against another team. It's a different thing than when you're in practice. But look at here, we got the interception. That's a couple interceptions we got. We got that one earlier with Betamosi, and then right there Whitner finishing things off. This Madden simulation's coming to a close. It's actually, the way this simulation played out, like I said, was pretty close to how it played out the first time around for these two teams. I said, I don't know if they're going to quite dominate them like this. I think it's going to actually be a close game, to tell you the truth. I think it'll end up being within one score. That's what I think anyway, even though you never know. Maybe Cleveland beats up on them again. It's possible. But I'm pretty sure Cleveland wins this one. Yeah, but you never know. You never know what's going to happen. But it'll definitely be fun to watch Johnny, and I think he'll have a good game. He's going to need to protect the ball. We threw that one interception with him, but it didn't actually really end up mattering because we ended up picking it right back off. But there's your gameplay, and if you liked the video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you want more content such as this, go ahead and subscribe. Also, leave a comment below and let me know what you think is going to happen in this game. Who do you think is going to win? Who's going to win the division? Let me know in the comments section. Thank you very much for watching. It's greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good day, and have a great weekend, and enjoy all the sports.